Hey everyone, this is Will, and welcome to another brand new and exciting episode of The Missing Piece. By continuing our conversation regarding what's happening in the nation of Mali, if you remember correctly, that not too long ago that I spoke to Scott Morgan, we're going to get to Scott in a second, regarding the Trump administration was pondering military involvement in the nation of Mali, and given the fact it was all about the counterterrorism policy. Keep in mind that today, when we think about the threats from the terrorists, that it's not just about the actions, it's more about the political ideology. And also, last time when I spoke to Scott, that we ended a conversation regarding the immigration policy in the US, given the fact that the Trump administration, again, it is very concerned about the immigration broken policy that possibly that bring terrorists into the US, which can be a major drawback for many purposes or many reasons. Now, I'm looking at the latest update. It says that Trump is considering strike on another nation. In addition to Mali, there's something else that we also need to understand. The better question we need to ask is how come that so far we have not heard anything or little information from the State Department? What is the Trump administration strategy for those countries? Again, it's not just about winning the tickets for November election, but also more about the uniting the international community from the foreign policy perspective. Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, let's bring back our amazing friend, Scott Morgan. And Scott has been the president of Red Eagle Enterprises since its inception in November 2012. He often uses his experience from serving in the U.S. military to address various projects. Currently, he's based in Washington, D.C., and his firm specializes in U.S. policy towards Africa, focusing on security and religious liberty. Well, Scott, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, my friend. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely, Scott. Such an honor to have you back on the show. I have to say, the last time you and I, we had a discussion regarding this possibility from the Trump administration weighing this military strategies or involvement for the nation of Mali. But right now, I am looking at a statement not only from the US, but also from the Malian foreign minister. It says, we have no confirmation and no official statement from the US or US officials on the matter. We are waiting to see what stance the US government will take. In addition, he added, I can assure you that Mali is not sitting idly by waiting for others to come and solve our problems. Let's just pause for the statement for a second, Scott. As I mentioned, as your background goes, that you often analyzes the situation in African countries. Now, based on what I just read to you from the Malian foreign minister, what do you make of that when he said that I can assure you that Mali is not sitting idly by waiting for others to come and solve the internal problems? Scott, what do you make of that?
Well, also during the recent week, I should say, like almost within hours of our last conversation, the Malian military received a shipment of Russian military vehicles. They were actually seen offloading in Lomé, Togo. And then they were actually being, seen heading towards Bamako and probably further north. Excuse me. So we know that they received some equipment from the Russians in the past week. So, but also in that time, is that new equipment or is it to re-equip? Because also we have, as our previous discussion, that a FAMA Africa Corps convoy was ambushed outside of Gal, and not many people have actually reported on this as well. But there's also a Turkish private military company called Satan that is now active inside Mali, and they do a lot of personal protection details inside Bamako. And one of the most interesting aspects of that is some of the fighters that Satan has actually sent into Mali are not actually Turkish. They're Syrian. They're former fighters who were for Bashar Assad, who were actually evacuated. We know they entered Africa through Libya and in some places, specifically in Mali and to a lesser extent Niger Republic, they have been acting as a subcontractor to the Africa Corps. So, and this is what I just mentioned. This is a dynamic that does not get a lot of press coverage. It has fallen off the radar from the human rights groups because also recently Human Rights Watch issued another report that has criticizing the junta in Bamako. So, and that gives so I'm actually not surprised to see the foreign minister make those remarks.
Scott, recently that you mentioned, based on the statement that I read to you, and I would say a few experts, including you, believe that Mali's public statement still leave open the possibilities of further collaboration with the US. Scott, can you dive into a little bit deeper about that? So, what I just read to you about the statement from the Malian foreign minister, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounded to me that the government has no limits of collaboration with the US government in terms of battling against or counter terrorism. But right now, it doesn't look like the Malian government has much interest in collaborating with the US at this moment. So, based on your analysis, if we believe, or if we were to believe, the collaboration with the US government were to happen, if not now, what would be the perfect timing? Because, again, you're the expert. When we talk about the growth of terrorism and the threat of terrorists, and these things happen, can take place in a split second. There's no tell and there's no a guarantee that it won't happen very soon. So
I was actually asked this question earlier by a couple friends of mine, and they don't think the U.S. will strike, and they're against the U.S. taking any action. But my counterpoint to that was, if we're Mali, the security situation is growing there. It may be necessary for the U.S. to take action. Because one of the things is not taking no action is actually taking an action. But as we for years, we've heard that there's been a steady mantra. The jihadists are moving south. We know they've been active in northern Benin, as they across the border from Niger Republic. All of the fact, we know that there's been an increased activity in northern Ghana. And, because the militants know the trade routes probably better than the government and the Russians do. And one of the reasons that I listed a couple of opportunities, reasons why they could do it. One of the reasons that I could see now, possibly for a U.S. military strike now, would actually be in support of Cote d'Ivoire. Because even before the Biden administration left office, and after the U.S. put out a base 191 in Agadez in Niger, we were looking for a place to house our UA vehicles, and Cote d'Ivoire recognized the position that they're in, and quietly they accepted that aid. We are actually seeing the Trump administration actually double down on this position, which is actually a good thing. Because if you've actually read if you people have actually read what I've been posting in recent days, officially Cote d'Ivoire has signed a state partnership deal with the Pennsylvania National Guard. So that is another reason why the U.S. could actually take action. And if you notice, if people who read my interview in the Daily Caller, I was asked, considering the counterterrorism strategy and the protection of African Christians, there is a small Christian community in Mali. They're mostly in rural areas, very not in the major population centers like Gao, Kidal, or even the capital Bamako. We know that churches have been destroyed. People caught in the crossfire, things like that. And when we learn of these incidents, is not through the media. Actually, it's either shared by the militants through their own media and social media, or if they're doing some liberation, Africa Corps is actually providing those details on their Telegram channel. So, some people would like to see an intervention on using that criteria. My view is right now I don't see that happening. And actually, I use Nigeria as an example where the Christian community, to their benefit, was actually used another decision by the Biden administration because, during the first Trump administration, Nigeria was designated a country of particular concern under the International Religious Freedom Act in 2020. The following year, before then Secretary of State Anthony Blinken arrived in Nigeria, the country was removed from that status, and no clear-cut answer was given, except for one. The most commonly heard answer we heard was, this was a mistake by the Trump administration that had to be rectified. And the carnage in Nigeria still continues to this day. And once again, the Trump administration has put Nigeria back on the CPC list. We're seeing increased engagement with the Nigerian military, but also in recent weeks, the U.S. Congress has frozen all aid to Nigeria, and you're not seeing much blowback against that, which in a way surprises me, despite the large lobbying effort that the Nigerian government currently has here in Washington. But going back to Mali, going back to about the African Christians, there's no such advocacy for the Christians in Mali. Although, the military action may be best, I also think that doing commercial investments and rectifying the mistake, as I mentioned to you earlier, by the Obama administration, canceling the MCC compact with Mali about rural electrification in the north, which nobody has tried to counter me on this. We can actually say that decision by the Obama administration is one of the core reasons why Mali is in the state it's in. And it was all because of the policy that people think that all coups are bad. But however, if you have a person who seized power through extrajudicial means and still retains power, that may be their only option to remove him. So as with most African policy decisions, there's a lot of areas where the situation becomes so murky, and that a clear-cut solution is not only practical, but probably not visible either.
Well, Scott, let's keep our conversation going. Again, recently you also mentioned the situation in Mali. It's getting way more intricate, not only because the relationship with the US, and also you mentioned, and I quote, although Russia's partnership with Mali complicates matter, the opportunity to embarrass the Kremlin may be exactly what draws the US into the conflict. Last time you and I we had the conversation regarding the Russian military or Russian forces involvement, but this is a further development which it's rather concerning because money has generated from the African conflict that really help prolong Russia's war in Ukraine. I think this is something that our viewers and audience don't quite connect the dots. So can you talk a little bit more about Russia's partnership with Mali at this moment, and why is that linked to the war in Ukraine at this moment? It's funny, or it's ironic, that how we are seeing the world is getting bigger and bigger when I think about economy, when I think about politics. But when we think about counterterrorism, when we think of the land of opportunities, it doesn't look like the world is getting bigger. As a matter of fact, the world is shrinking unintentionally. So that's why we are seeing those dots are being connected all together. So again, Scott, going back to the question, how is that partnership between Mali and Russia can link to the war in Ukraine? Your thoughts?
Well, it's been documented that Wagner/Africa Corps has economic interest in Mali. And some of the funds generated from those efforts, which include gold mining and to a lesser extent other exploration for uranium and other materials, some of those funds have been used to finance Africa Corps operations in Ukraine, which, and with the recent offensives by JNIM, the al-Qaeda branch, and the Azawad separatists, and placing pressure on the Africa Corps formations in the northern part of the country, the revenue sources has taken a hit. We don't know the total extent of the financial cost of the damage to the Russian economy and their efforts, but we've seen you almost have to be blind not to realize right now Ukraine has the upper hand right now against Russia. And you almost have to, and with the attempted decapacitation strike in late April, and the subsequent offensive where they were pushing where Wagner was actually, or the Africa Corps was pushed out of several bases in the north, and that they've actually had to consolidate their position. And then and Africa Corps even lost fighter planes during that April offensive. So they actually had to take a hit in that, these units had to be replenished, and we're not just talking small arms and ammunition, but we're also talking about heavy lift capability vehicles, MRAPs, mine resistant vehicles, helicopters, in some cases fighters. We have not seen a adequate financial cost of that April offensive, but judging that, and we're still seeing increased reports of Russia recruiting foreign fighters from other parts of Africa and the world to be used in Ukraine, and that also shows that well, to be frank, both countries now have a manpower issue in
Mm.
Ukraine. But let's go back, going back to Mali for a second. It's a size, sizable country, and right now, the government's, no, I shouldn't say the government, the junta is looking for a new scapegoat. For a while there, they're actually using Algeria as a scapegoat due to their position. They were the ones that negotiated the 2015 ceasefire, which led to elections before the last two coups. But now, if you look, including articles in places like Responsible Statecraft and others, we noticed that the new boogeyman appears to be Mauritania, and that's a country which is even larger than Mali, has a substantially smaller army than Mali, and also, best way to put it, tries to maintain a delicate balance between the U.S., France, Morocco, and Iran.
Mm.
So, some people would say, the great game is being played in West Africa.
Scott, I want to wrap up our conversation again, going back to the country of Nigeria. According to a State Department spokesperson, and said the Trump administration has made it clear that protecting religious freedom for all individuals, including Christians, the most persecuted religious group worldwide, it's a priority. And right now we're looking at the country of Mali and also the country of Nigeria. Correct me if I'm wrong, that Nigeria, as the seventh most dangerous countries in the world for Christians, Mali, it's only ranked as 15. Believe me, these are not quite the promising or good news for Christians. And we know that the Trump administration, they care so much about religious freedom, and they care about the protection of the Christians, not just in the US, but also around the world. So, Scott, can you talk a little bit more? This kind of tie in together. It's what is the Trump administration doing, or perhaps will do, for the Christian communities? Again, not only for the Nigerians, but also for the Christians. You mentioned a small group of numbers in Mali. And also, I guess in a bigger term, it's about protecting the long-term interests in making sure that the Christians are going to be well protected in the region of West Africa and make them feel safe and comfortable in order to understand the true meaning of democracy. I want to hear your final thoughts, Scott.
Well, I would just start off by saying this. Personally, I gave another interview about this topic, and I was actually said I would love. There are other places in Africa where I would love to see what happened in Nigeria play out. I specifically mentioned the Congo. I specifically mentioned northern Mozambique, which is those two areas. Unless there's a large scale attack against like a church or whatever, you don't hear about the persecution of Christians there. Are they less Are they less deserving of concerted U.S. action? As you know, because also one of the things that we also have to do, we also have to look at is some of these places. Christians some of these are actually victims of economics, which is actually one of the arguments that they use in Nigeria. That, because they actually use this, they describe it as a farmer herder conflict. The Christians have the farms, and then, the Fulani attackers are the herders. and there's more sympathy towards the herders. But one of the things I actually would like to see more consistency from this administration, because we've seen one airstrike and the deployment of these special forces into Nigeria. We've also seen the special forces deployed into Cameroon, which is another country which has the very similar fault lines as what Nigeria has. We haven't heard any specific news items talking about any apprehensions by the Cameroonian security forces with American support or things like that. We have not heard that yet. But that's a benchmark other people will probably be looking for. But as for Mali, they were a security partner of the U.S. before 2011. They're actually a participant in the Flintlock counterterrorism exercises, which that was an exercise that went away after the coups in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And I think what it is that the Malians have been abused by they've been abused by the French. Now they're being abused by the Russians. And in some ways they have the idea that we have to do it ourselves so we don't get burned again. Because even though the French pulled out and then the Russians went in, it was not until the Russians went in that when the rest of the EU pulled out, because there are missions there from countries like Latvia and other countries that were there trying to help out. But when Wagner went in, that military cooperation stopped, and at the same time, most discussions about helping Mali also stopped here in Washington.
Well, I mean, again, brother, it's
and that doesn't have, and that has never, and that has not helped the Malians, because because I've actually known people that were working in the force space and others that, as long they wanted to help the Malians, but as long as the Russians are in the country, they're not willing to talk to them. And that train of thought, the only people that hurts is actually the Malians. Are not the people in the junta, but the Malians out and who are struggling day to day, trying to keep a roof over their head and food on the table.
Well, I mean, again, Scott, it saddens me to hear that what's happening to the Christians or the Christian communities in both countries. And that's why I always say we always keep them in prayer. But meanwhile, that what you shared with us regarding what's happening in Mali and also the possible collaboration between the U.S. government and Mali, it's crucial. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, such an honor to speak to Scott Morgan. Scott has been the president of Red Eagle Enterprises since its inception in November 2012. He's based in Washington, D.C., and he often uses his experience from serving in the U.S. military to analyze the current political atmosphere, especially regarding the continent of Africa. Well, Scott, it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for your time. And we love to keep in touch with you as we continue to discover and explore the next step. And hopefully we have something new and updates from you very soon. So thank you, Scott.